Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this really interesting panel that's perhaps not at the best time slot. But anyway, let's move forward. The name of the title is, of course, Making Up MSM, a nod to Ian Hacking's work, Remapping Key Populations in Global Health. And I'm just sort of going to introduce the panelists and then take a seat. We have Matt Tillman here, Paul Boyce, Cal Brook. Unfortunately, Patrick Awanda is not going to be able to make it. We have Suzanne Leclerc-Madlala, and unfortunately, Richard Parker is also not able to make it and sends his regrets. We don't have his presence, but we do have his words, and I'll read his discussion after Suzanne if there's time. Okay? So, Paul. Or sorry, Matt, you're first.
Okay. So this paper draws upon research conducted in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, among sexual and gender minorities to consider the impact of global health initiatives targeting them for HIV interventions. Since 2010, I've been following the social life of a U.S.-sponsored program aimed at curbing the HIV epidemic among key populations, including men who have sex with men, or MSM. When I first arrived in Abidjan in summer of 2010, local NGOs Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel ran their programs on small budgets funded by French donors and had few paid staff. Arc-en-Ciel was housed in a bare one-room office, and the newly formed Alternative had no official headquarters, holding its meetings in private homes. By the time I returned to Abidjan in 2012, PEPFAR, or the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, was financing a $1.7 million project aimed at improving access to HIV prevention and care among men who have sex with men, and there was a new player in town. Heartland Alliance International, the global arm of a Chicago-based NGO, had responded to PEPFAR's 2010 call for, quote, new primary partners to work with, quote, highly vulnerable populations. In the earlier formation of this relationship, between FHI 360, or Family Health International 360, the local organizers were hired as technical advisors on those projects. Now they were receiving funding for their own organization. The budgets of the two organizations more than quadrupled overnight. They acquired large headquarters, well-equipped with computers, office furniture, LCD projectors, and Wi-Fi capabilities, and employed government-certified HIV peer educators with different titles, responsibilities, and pay scales. Increasingly, large nonprofits like Heartland Alliance act as financial intermediaries between donor organizations like PEPFAR and organizations comprised of community members like Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel. Jennifer Wolch coined the term the shadow state to describe the nonprofit sector's role in service provision in the wake of neoliberal economic reforms. In Côte d'Ivoire, this nonprofit industrial complex is rooted in historical shifts in the global economy. After 2 decades of economic prosperity, the Ivorian economy faltered. Until the late 70s, Côte d'Ivoire had been the African poster child of post-colonial success. But in the early 80s, the nation, debt-burdened and with a newly devalued currency, was extremely vulnerable to neoliberal economic reform. Côte d'Ivoire received 26 structural adjustment loans between 1980 and 1999. These loans mandated the systematic dismantling of public services, while public investments in sectors like health, education, and housing dried up. These divestments negatively impacted health and education, as user fees were introduced into the Ivorian national health system, and schooling fees were also implemented. Rents skyrocketed while job and salary cuts were made across the public sector, which at the time was the largest employer in Côte d'Ivoire. In accordance with the Central Bank of France, the IMF, and the Central Bank of West African States, they devalued the regional currency, the West African franc, in '94. These crippling reforms exacerbated the effect of the AIDS crisis in Côte d'Ivoire and worsened the social conditions that made the HIV epidemic so devastating throughout the global South. Until recently, Côte d'Ivoire has had the highest rate of HIV in the West African region, with a 6% seroprevalence rate among the general population when PEPFAR began the programming and named it as an original focus country in 2003, or 4, I believe. In this context, NGOs focusing on the inclusion and incorporation of vulnerable populations obscured the ways in which neoliberal economic reforms created the very conditions for many of the same social inequalities that they sought to address. Like in other areas of the Global South, the shadow state, comprised of international NGOs and donor institutions, have attempted to fill this gap. 75% of all funding for HIV in Cote d'Ivoire comes through PEPFAR. However, most of these financial commitments are not funneled through the public health sector, guided by neoliberal reforms, but through private NGOs. As community-based movements, like Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel, were transformed into community-based NGOs, peer educators and activists entered into a relationship that was characterized, even named, by their lack of power. Indeed, PEPFAR refers to them as sub-implementation partners. Wilson Gilmore argues that grassroots organizations are incorporated into the nonprofit system where they labor in, quote, the shadow of the shadow state, or the shadow of larger nonprofits. When they enter into relationship with larger nonprofits and funding institutions, activists at community-based NGOs are pretty much forced to adopt a nonprofit model and a corporate restructuring of labor that channels activists into narrowly defined roles. This was the case for Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel, who went from being a band of ragtag activists to filling more clearly defined and structured positions. The peer educators and activists at Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel were anything but receptacles for donor-driven agendas, nor did they always adopt the agendas that had been set for them. Instead, they adapted the agendas, ideas, and tactics of PEPFAR and Heartland Alliance as they saw fit, to the best of their ability. When I returned to Abidjan in 2012, peer educators and activists at Alternative spoke openly to me about their relationships with their new funder. On an afternoon in September 2012, I conducted an interview with Alternative's Director of Communications after more than 2 months of doing participant observation and interviews with he and other members of the organizations. Antoine was seated across from me on a stackable outdoor chair in the garden just outside the headquarters of Alternative. My interview questions had begun to touch on the subject of international donor institutions and their implementation partners, and Antoine, like most of his colleagues when faced with this question, was through with the pleasantries. PEPFAR was financing Heartland Alliance to the tune of $1.7 million for the 2011 fiscal year, and peer educators and activists at Alternative, the sub-implementation partners, were barely scraping by. In PEPFAR's 2011 country operational plan, which was drawing to a close at the time of this interview, only $42,000 of the $1.7 million to Heartland Alliance had reached Alternative. Antoine leaned over the wooden stool that teetered between us, careful to make sure my digital recorder captured his thoughts. He was agitated, and the professionalized facade he had perfected as the director of communications faded away. For just a moment. He spoke deliberately and with purpose, placing his hand on his left knee as he leaned forward, his right hand pointing in the distance. He leaned back in his chair, telling me he'd start from the beginning. He said, "So there I am working when the first representative from Heartland Alliance came. It was a dream. I have a dream." And he said that phrase in English, sort of invoking Martin Luther King Jr. And we dreamed higher. They came telling us that they came to give us their power. They came to give us autonomy, us, the members of the community. That was the goal of the project. Heartland Alliance had arrived, but the funding did not provide the autonomy for which Antoine and others had hoped. Alain, the head of monitoring and evaluation for Alternative, complained that Heartland Alliance and other U.S. intermediaries were siphoning off funds from PEPFAR and the Global Fund. He said, when financing comes in the name of the community but has to go through an intermediary, that means the financing gets reduced. That's what we've noticed on the ground. Me, I'm a man on the ground. It's the community members who raise awareness. The community members do that, the awareness building. We write the reports for Heartland, and Heartland takes the report to PEPFAR. You know, they say we are poorly trained. I agree, but like I said before, when someone isn't well trained, you train them. And when you train them, they get that first experience. You have to give them that first experience. You have to get that first experience. Peer educators and activists also complained of a relentless focus on numbers-based results. Taped to the wall of Alternative's executive director, Claver's office, were poster board-sized Post-its with, quote, new SM targets to be reached that year. These numbers were a constant source of anxiety and frustration for the staff at Alternative. In 2011, Heartland Alliance set the target at 1,570 MSM reached. In 2012, that target jumped to 2,153 new MSM, meaning they weren't able to count the 1,570 they had counted the year before to meet their quotas. The staff often joked about the enormity of these targets, noting if the targets continued to rise this way in 2013, they would have to start, quote, making MSM. This outsourcing of HIV prevention programming and testing is part of a broader trend in the commodification of testing and came with the expectation that these community members would recruit an ever-increasing number of MSM into intervention programming, data which that they could then use to prove a return on donor investment. In this way, evidence-based interventions put communities in service of evidence production rather than the other way around. In October of 2012, tensions between Heartland and the community-based NGOs took a turn for the worse. Already a month behind in paying the peer educators at the two organizations, Heartland Alliance proposed a new way of working together to fulfill the requirements for PEPFAR's 2012 country operational plan. In a meeting, they explained that they aim to institute performance-based pay for peer educators working at the two organizations. They proposed paying peer educators $500 SAFE, or approximately $1 per, quote, new MSM reached. This performance-based pay model draws on business models of development that create competition between organizations and between staff within the same organizations while turning community members into single dollar signs. The proposed program would have effectively removed long-term social support for HIV-positive members of the community from the organization's formal objectives. Heartland Alliance's strategy would have also defunded transportation and activity costs for the HIV support groups and compromised other long-term relationships that peer educators and activists had worked to build with some of the most vulnerable members of the community. Many peer educators and activists voiced these concerns in the internal meetings that Claver held to discuss the suggested plan in early November, and they coordinated a coalition-based response with other CBOs to reject the new plan. Speaking to me hours before that meeting, Claver said, "With Heartland, if you're a new person, that's great. But if you already came and we already wrote your name down, that means you're not eligible to take any more condoms. If that's the case, then you can't come back for more, because they put in the action plan that you have to reach 2,000 new people. But just because someone is not a new person doesn't mean that you're going to leave him. With Heartland, it's not like that, because it's only numbers that interest them." The internal organization of both Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel Plus became hierarchical as administrative norms about positions and responsibilities changed to reflect a corporate business structure as specified in their government charter and their contract with Heartland Alliance. With the new funding regimes enabled by PEPFAR, competition between Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel Plus became fierce. Patrick had explained this to me earlier. He was at Arc-en-Ciel, the other organization, which had split. Alternative had split off of Arc-en-Ciel, so he's sort of giving this history here. He said, "The direction of leadership in the community and the divisions suit the financial partners. The partners exacerbated the problems in the community, and they are the ones who divide the community further. Today, we haven't managed to reunite our forces to address these questions together. Alternative was born because of this problem of leadership, and I blame the financial partners, who shouldn't have taken the role to incite, but to encourage divisions in the community for whom they have been called to work. They should rather take the role of regrouping the community to make them stronger so that they can address their difficulties with a single voice. But our gay community history here, our divisions, were encouraged by financial partners." Others insisted that some Abidjan-based staff members of Heartland Alliance aimed to weaken the local NGOs when they proposed to use the recently awarded Global Fund money to contract the peer educators directly, cutting out key leadership from Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel altogether. Claver complained about this business maneuver. He told me, "They impose everything. That's why we treat them like a gangster donor, or even the mafia. You say that you come to work with people, but that's not the way to collaborate." In a public display of this dissatisfaction, Claver posted this rant on Facebook, and I'll read it briefly. "Global financial crisis or corruption? Hell, what world are we in, and where are we headed when an international NGO that is supposed to be a financial backer tries to take the place of implementation partners? It's really sad, to think it's being done with the complicity of certain states really makes me want to vomit." As Dylan Rodriguez argues in his examination of what he calls the nonprofit industrial complex, the professionalization of local activism can be restrictive. While there is some truth to this idea, activists and peer educators at Alternative remain critical of the ideas, agendas, and strategies of their donors and partners. And while it is true that some of the research participants joined Alternative and Arc-en-Ciel as a kind of career move, it cannot be argued that theirs was a lucrative business for young Abidjanais to enter into. Their stipends were miserably low. Furthermore, being employed by increasingly visible community-based organizations can be dangerous. Rumors about affiliation with these organizations made it more difficult for peer educators and activists to exercise discretion around knowledge of their sexuality and sexual behavior, a reality that could carry severe economic, social, and emotional consequences in familial and other networks. In their conversations and actions, activists and peer educators regularly challenged the fundamentally unequal donor relationships that existed between them and Heartland, between them and PEPFAR, and ultimately between the Ivoirian and U.S. governments. Erica, 23-year-old peer educator at Alternative, said, "In Africa, we," meaning sexual minorities, "have become a bit like AIDS. We're an industry," meaning that most people are taking more care of what is going back in their pockets. I'd been back from my field site in Abidjan for about a year when I saw a post on Facebook from Claver, the executive director that I've mentioned already. In his post, he rants against a recent audit from Heartland Alliance International, who had expressed a concern that the 3 HIV peer educators who had been certified by the Ivorian government to test key populations weren't finding enough HIV positive MSM. This concern about dwindling numbers of HIV positive MSM tested by the PEPFAR-funded program was based on data from a study conducted in 2010 and 2011 that estimated 18% of MSM living in Abidjan were HIV positive. Claver wrote, have both a quote from him here, but also his Facebook post, and probably one of my favorite pictures of him ever, saying, "Wow, I'm really speechless after reading points to improve upon in the supervision report about our 3 HIV testers. They said only 1 key population tested positive since the beginning of this year." He goes on to say, "I'm really shocked that a project that we have been leading for 5 years, that when we began we had more than 12 people testing positive each month, and now that the HIV positive rate is falling, they speak of this as a point to improve upon. I was waiting for his recommendation, and this is what he gave us: improve the targeting of the target population for counseling and testing." He goes on to say, "It's really stupid that this guy thinks MSM are not capable of becoming aware of HIV risk and changing their behavior after 5 years of us talking to them. He is the one we should improve upon, or maybe just fire him." And when I asked him about this shortly thereafter, he said, "As far as testing goes, they decide that we test enough people, but that there aren't enough HIV positive people. And so for them, since there aren't enough HIV positive people, they think we aren't testing the actual target. After 5 years, how many are left? How many fags can there be in Abidjan? That's the problem. That's what they don't understand." His complaint was not all that unique, though certainly pointed to a contradictory logic. Anthropologist Elsa Fan wrote of a similar situation in her fieldwork on testing scale-up among MSM in China. Upon a colleague explaining to her that the organization was anxious to find more HIV infection among MSM, Fan questioned this logic. Wouldn't that mean that the epidemic was out of control? Is that a desirable outcome? Her research participant explained that the detection and enrollment in HIV care and treatment would actually suggest that the epidemic is under control. She writes about her further clarification as our participant explained, and I'm quoting Elsa here. "There's a fear and assumption," quoting Elsa, quoting her participant, "there's a fear and assumption that there are more infections out there, especially among MSM, so we are pushing testing and hoping to find more HIV positive, because this means that the more people you find, the more you can control the epidemic. There's a real fear that infections in the MSM populations will explode." This style of logic, this contradiction, this out-there-ness of HIV positive MSM is the subject of this talk today. It constitutes the kind of making up of people described by Hacking and expanded upon by medical anthropologists. Claver explained it this way: "It's like they want us to make up HIV positive people. If we say that out of 112 people we tested, 60 are positive, they will say, yippee. Unfortunately, we can't make them up. Heartland wants us to make them up, but we can't, so it's complex. We are asked to reach 7,000 MSM per year, new MSM." I know I'm really low on time, so I'm going to move forward a bit. In PEPFAR funding for prevention activities in Abidjan has increasingly decreased from 27% of the overall budget in 2010 to 15% in 2015. At the same time, funding allocated for care and treatment has increased from 48% of the overall budget in 2010 to 61% in 2015. All the while, though, testing remains central to treatment goals, but community-based prevention efforts are increasingly viewed as only pipelines for enrollment in treatment programs. Antoine said, "Meanwhile, every testing done," oops, this is out of order. He said, "I think that's PEPFAR's new strategy. It's coming from the Americans, to always have results on which to base our work. They are more focused on the results than the quality of the services that are provided. These last few years, when they show us their COP, or the country operational plan, the sensitization and prevention activities are no longer important. For them, what is important is testing, and when the person is tested positive, how to retain them." just have one more little paragraph, if that's okay. Metrics involved in systems of medical governance and evidence-based interventions may create new problems, as we see here. Stats sometimes function to displace facts. In this case, metrics and accounting are the new norm, and they may actually disrupt perfectly good health interventions like the kind done by Alternative. What happens to health when this happens, when metrics become the new norm? Again, we see that communities are put in the service of evidence production rather than the other way around. I'll also just add to this that communities are put in the service of not only evidence production, but of propping up the very services that are intended to serve them. As seen here, though, in their conversations and actions, peer educators regularly challenge this fundamentally unequal donor-recipient relationship. In doing so, they offer a critique of the very assemblage in which they have become increasingly incorporated. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to reflect on some work which in some ways sort of evolved from my original PhD work, which was based in Kolkata in India, and subsequent postdoctoral work, but also predates that in terms of how I became involved in work in that location from 1996 onwards, which seems like a very long time ago at the moment. So I'm sort of reflecting back a bit over time. I'm not really going to offer lots of contextual history per se, though. That's sort of in the background to what I'm reflecting on. And what I'm offering here is a fragment from a chapter of a book that I'm developing. And the book is called Sexual Worldings, and it's sort of trying to think about the relationship between ethnographic knowledge, HIV, the theorization of HIV, and sexual life worlds and subjectivity, using India as the kind of contextual frame for considering those thought processes, as it were, and their implications for contemporary HIV prevention. And in this chapter, I'm sort of developing a kind of object-oriented ontology. I'm not going to go into lots of theoretical detail about that, but I'm thinking what kind of object category is MSM, and how does it relate to a sense of sexual subjectivity, and that kind of peculiar tension between the category being something objective, but also something which is used in subjective terms when people say I am MSM, for example, which is a framing which I think many of us might be familiar with. So I'm going to read from the paper, and I might break off at some points. But so the early days of HIV prevention research and intervention brought new analytical attention to the inadequacy of language to capture the range and diversity of what was conceived as the domain of human sexuality at that time, especially but not only in cross-cultural contexts. It became increasingly apparent very rapidly that terms such as gay or homosexual, which were sort of used really sort of in the early days of the epidemic with a certain kind of certitude, did not adequately describe the context of self-identities, performance, and ways of being associated with same-sex desiring experience and risk. And for me, a very formative piece on that was the book Conceiving Sexualities by John Gagnon and Richard Parker. MSM as a designation for men who have sex with men became popularized at that time, initially in the US, the UK, and Australia, as an attempt to designate those men who had sex with other men, but for whom this practice did not necessarily correlate into a sense of subjectivity or explicit identity per se, however defined, or indeed not defined in terms of any kind of sort of out there self-presentation. This can be conceived as a kind of policy frame that sought to conceive of the subject-object, perhaps, but by focusing on behavior. So the problem was that many men who have sex with men do not self-identify. HIV prevention is predicated on identification are not going to work, so this sort of iteration of behavioral category. So focusing on behavior was seen to be imperative for an improved understanding of HIV epidemiology and the demographics of risk groups and practices and HIV transmission, significantly as these might have occurred outside of frames and terms of identifying. Although the terms MSM did not arise within the milieu of queer activism and theory per se, it might be read as in some ways a prefigurative aspect of that politics, especially vis-a-vis the way in which HIV prevention research methods foreshadowed new questions for sexualities research internationally, questions that, like queer epistemologies, displace assumed correlations between terms of identity, practice, life world, and subjectivity. So within some fields of public health practice, which I think you're alluding to, MSM is commonly used as a kind of neutral descriptor for an apparently self-evident category of people, men who have sex with men. In other contexts, including those associated with HIV prevention research in other terms, the term is used more equivocally, its limitations admitted and even used subject to apology, in that the term assumes that the object categories men and sex, for example, are sort of fixed and self-evident domains with a description of gender and sexual being. In these more reflexive and deconstructivist modes of research and writing, one relevant observation is the apparent use of MSM as a term of identity, as in the phrase, "I am MSM," has been increasingly heard throughout the course of the epidemic in sort of many sort of international contexts, especially of those associated with the community organisation rights and HIV prevention for gender and sexual minorities. So some have conceived of this use list as a kind of new identity category after a kind of Foucauldian type correlation between subjectivity and discourse giving rise to new ideas about self and new discourses about self. In simple terms, the claim that I am MSM suggests that this has become a new kind of identity rubric. And yet within this uses, there are evident ontological tensions between the abstract epidemiological category and the subject cognizance in terms of saying I am this category somehow. And it is this density, this sort of ontological density that I sort of want to sort of reflect on a little bit here. I want to sort of think, well, what's going on when people say I am MSM? So in terms of the intimate effects of the MSM discourse, the term has also been conceived as a form of violation and an interruption of public health language into the terms and lives of others as a means of producing objects for surveillance and risk assessment, as you sort of alluded to. HIV work carelessly intruding into more tacit and unspoken cultures of intimacy and effect, producing peculiar categorizations and form of recognition as an effect. This has been so often by incorporating people into HIV prevention community projects, assigning the designation men who have sex with men or MSM to people, and this somehow transmitting into an epithet for self. An objectifying epidemiological term becoming a term for the subjective designation of self and into sort of a stigmatized sexual other. And I recall particularly sort of working in community projects around West Bengal where people would come in and these would be interviewed by the counsellor in the project and they said, well, which of these categories are you? And you're sort of marshalled literally into a category, a sort of tick spot, go, you're MSM, and you go, no, that's you, there you go. And so that there's something going on in that process other than the tick box or the misrepresentation. There's also a complicated subjectification going on in that process. Against this background, intrinsic within the I am MSM usage, as has been argued, is the shadow protestation, typically unstated, but I do not identify as gay. I'm MSM, but I do not identify as gay. So Tom Belstoff, for example, has described this intrinsic proclamation as typically stating a resistance to the hegemony of gay identity discourses as these disperse globally with their associations with Western and modern terms of identifying and the limitations to speak for alternative subjects and standpoints. It was out of this that MSM became an especially used in epidemiological and demographic work with men of colour and other groups wherein ethnic identity and cultural context was seen to prevail against the widespread use of gay as a kind of term of identification, at least in part. This foregrounded the use of the term in international health work out of a kind of common understanding in HIV prevention work that terms, as I mentioned, such as gay, were inherently cultural and culturally specific, perhaps Western. MSM could perform as an apparently sort of neutral signifier in comparison. It's in these terms, even as the term has been recognised as stigmatising and pejorative, that it has also had an appeal, perhaps, as a claim to self, but a contested one. Because, of course, the effects of this usage and the spread of a term such as MSM through global public health and its popular uses that I'm alluding to are not neutral. They act in an unequal post-colonial world. As Andil Gossin has claimed, and I'm quoting from Gossin, identification of the MSM as a high-risk entity in development serves several purposes. The naming of men engaged in homosexual sexual acts in the global south, as well as non-white men in the global north, works to inferiorize both the acts and the men participating in them. MSM is to gay what barbarian is to citizen, a figure with unbridled sexuality, lacking both self-control and responsibility, and dangerous. End of the quote. So given this very clearly pejorative kind of way of associated toward the category, why might some people in the global south that Gossin alludes to, so to speak, or elsewhere, want to claim the term as a designation for self? if indeed that is what is going on. Claiming oneself to be MSM as a subjective claim complicates not only the use of the terminology in health work, but also its situated politics, perhaps as a form of violation associated with problematic effects of post-colonial modernity. And then the evocation of the unbridled risky sexuality is associated with certain, often pejoratively racialized others. Given this, and this sort of way in which it feels that actually why would MSM consolidate in these contexts? Belstoff has conceived the I am MSM usage as proleptic. By this he means that he sees its growing popularization internationally as somehow out of time and context, as if occurring as an identity prior to the kinds of political or social mobilization and populism in the media and elsewhere that might normally be associated with the global population of a term of sexual identity. As such, in tracing this proleptic thought or prescience, this sort of genealogy of the term sort of going forward, as it were, projecting forward as a way to explain its usage as a term in the present, Belstoff stresses ways in which identities are not necessarily formed in respect of linear, clearly causal trajectories. They might be anomalous. They might not really sort of make sense. They might not be what we would expect given the circumstances. Well, I want to wonder about that here. I'm not sure if I sort of agree and sort of don't. So my own first encounter with the I am MSM usage occurred sort of circa 1996 when I was first working in a community project in Calcutta off the back of a master's degree that I was doing. And a close friend of mine, when I was sort of first meeting them, I was asking about their sexuality, but they became a close friend many years after. But I was first meeting at the time, and they were saying I am MSM, and this was, I think, the first time I remember hearing that. And in the longer version of this paper, I reflect on that as both a specific and ubiquitous moment, in that I remember it very clearly as something quite specific, but it's something I've heard so many times subsequently that I can barely record it in its specificity, and it's something that I've heard other people recount to me also as a strange encounter. You know, this person said, I am MSM, what's going on? So it's almost both a specific and generic ethnographic moment for me. So at that time I was working in what was then the very early days of sort of MSM type projects in India. I was working in the NGOs that were called, at that time called the NAS Foundation. They went on to have lots of different names for various reasons. But I was involved in the first sort of project of this kind in Calcutta, which was resonant with what you were describing about Côte d'Ivoire, and it was just a one room with one laptop that I happened to bring with me. It was very under-resourced at the time. So while at this time it was evident to me that in some ways the men who I met were describing themselves as MSM were indeed refusing a gay identity, it also seemed to me that they were, more significantly, refusing a process of subjectification and, by association, identification as predicated on same-sex desire and practice. It seemed to me that it was not so much that the critical insistence going on was that I am MSM but I do not identify as gay, but more that I am MSM, I do not identify. This means this was a very kind of complex ontology, a convoluted relationship between knowledge making in our NGO, using that category MSM, subject claims and embodied being, sort of in a way counting, quantifying MSM through the city, but also refusing that category and using that category in complex ways in people's experience. This, it seemed, was in concert with a wide and entrenched antithesis to processes of individuation and individual identification associated with a changing socio-economic context. Certainly while in 1996, this time, market liberalism in India was not exactly new, it was nonetheless relatively early days. Friends from among the cohort I was working with in NAS Calcutta at the time, many of them still friends and colleagues, would often reflect on the pace of change in the city with new building work, new goods in the markets and so on. This was still a time with little capacity for internet connectivity in the city, when new phone lines were hard to obtain, people didn't have cell phones, and when a move from state TV to other media was still relatively new and emerging. Calcutta was among other Indian cities that had not been especially at the hub of market growth, in part due to sort of a complex sort of socialist, communist, political, economic legacies. Against this background, my friends and colleagues often earnestly discussed the changes happening around them at a pace that would rapidly increase, even as many aspects of the city landscape and cultural expectations of kinship and community obligation endured. It was against this background that the IM-MSM usage was occurring as part, I suggest, of a resistance to, or rather a kind of ambivalence towards, the emerging flow of market economics, new cultural imperatives for sort of identification and so on. Not declaring oneself as gay, but as MSM was, it seemed to me, a part of this ambivalence towards sort of putative westernization. In more recent research in small towns in West Bengal, even many of the male-desiring men that we work with explicitly declaimed the salience of sexual identities in their lives, even as they might be involved in HIV prevention work for MSM. So same-sex desiring people actively out promoting the rights of MSM, but also sort of averring the significance of that in their own lives. Such work was seen as imperative, but often personally disassociated from an intimate sense of sexualness. This was underscored by discussions about sexuality and rights in India, and the terms that were often seen as imposing urban, modern, and global frames of identification into contexts in which people did not seek explicit recognition as same-sex sexual subjects in unequivocal or whole terms. Against this background, the political economies of care and effect rendered via a term like IM-MSM were not only proleptic, I think, but somehow also occurred of that moment, outside, sort of evoking something outside of the imagined relationship between the structural, political, economic circumstances and identity at a given time, but also expressive of socio-economic contemporaneity, and a specific kind of anxiety about the imperative for individuation from a form of sexual identity associated with modernity and claims to rights. The term IM-MSM, ironically, might offer a retreat from explicit identity configurations and their problematic associations with modernity, surveillance, and so on, even as that term is also used as a contemporary means of surveillance. So there are lots of complicated performative possibilities going on in this claim to self, IM-MSM. What is interesting to me here is the subjective investment by social actors into a seeming objectifying category, MSM, as a term that can convey both an apparent effect of an internationalizing circuit of ideas concerning sexualities in the moment and the influence of HIV prevention work in framing terms of identity. At the same time, MSM may also obviate that investment into an object property that is somehow removed from the political and personal implications of a subject claim to identity. That might be associated, for example, with saying I am gay or I am queer, for example. It is a stake in a modern term, but also not. It is a kind of flow, but also a kind of cut. An example of a framing of identity that extends out of a contemporary circulation of a term, but also sort of pulls away from it. If I should have 2 minutes, okay, yeah, great, I'm nearly finished. So it's not that the IM-MSM usage is simply indicative of a new generative subject, but also, oddly and uncannily, it is disruptive of the possibility for that subject too. Thus, while with Bolstoff I see the intrinsic, but I do not identify as gay within the IM-MSM usage, I see something more going on too that absolutely speaks to the present moment and the ambivalence about claims to explicit queer and same-sex identifying positions that are emerging in the present world. And it's through this that I'm sort of then trying to open up thinking about how, as ethnographers, how do we relate to this kind of way of being? How do we relate to the kind of knowledge that is produced through public health interventions, how that's enfolded into people's lives in ways which are sort of like run counter to one another, but somehow also sort of absorbed into people's being, because much of our sense of being also sort of is not whole, consistent, but is partial and fragmented and inconsistent. Okay, thank you.
I do have some accessible versions of my talk if anyone wants them. They're right there. Thanks to Rob and Elsa and Matt for organizing this panel and inviting me to be a part of it. Okay, I'll just start. In mid-2014, at a workshop for LGBT-identified persons in Malawi in Southern Africa, attendees reported to NGO staff members leading the meeting that fake gays had infiltrated this space in the interest of obtaining per diems distributed that morning. This accusation called upon staff to suss out the truth of potential interlopers' sexual identifications and demonstrates participants' very real fears that fake gays might embed themselves as spies to feed information to those opposed to the NGO's gay agenda in a homophobic context, or at the very least steal benefits that were meant for so-called real gays. As I will show today, the figure of the fake gay foregrounds the co-production of value, authenticity, and sexual selves amid circuits of resource distribution in Southern Africa. This paper draws on a sort of book manuscript very much in progress that is going to be an ethnography of LGBT activism in NGO worlds and sort of shows how LGBT Malawians navigate these cumbersome apparati of global health and also what I call economies of harm, sort of networks of social relations that present opportunities for transactions that are both risky and potentially profitable. And here I want to acknowledge my colleague and friend, Gift Trappens, with whom we have a forthcoming paper in Critical Public Health on the idea of MSM as victims of research and the ethics of engagement in these kinds of interventions. So recycling language from Malawian news outlets that alleges that citizens fake marginalized sexual orientations to gain access to foreign money, medicines, or resources. I'm hoping to track queer becomings, sexual, economic, and social, as they play out in NGO spaces. So today I'll just present a few vignettes from long-term fieldwork with an LGBT rights NGO that I call here Human Rights Now, or HRN, in Malawi's capital, Lilongwe. I'll show how the figure of the fake gay, rooted in arbitrations of fake or real, sincerity or cunning, is a useful site from which to understand how categories such as MSM become sites of performative labor, whereby competently and ambivalently inhabiting nominalizations can bring monetary, social, or other gain. In Malawi, the phrase gay for pay circulates widely in national media, the public imagination, political speech, and within LGBT communities themselves. Some of the arguments rehearsed since the mid-2000s in Malawi include donors are forcing Malawians to adopt homosexuality, donors should keep their money while Malawi lives in impoverished dignity, and people involved in promoting LGBT rights are hunting for money from donors. While the fake gay referenced above is a mythologized figure, questions around sincerity, authenticity, and risk were on the minds of LGBT persons and NGO staff who regularly face violence, blackmail, and outing. Yet, the fake gay is a figure with multiple valences, as we will see. Mavuto and I first met at the workshop mentioned above, sponsored by a Dutch organization, one among many that we attended together. Mavuto's mannerisms and orientation to the world were quite campy. He finds piecework, braiding hair, and doing manicures in a salon with his closest friend. He plans his walking routes to avoid men who attack him whenever they have the chance. He's known for repurposing secondhand clothes into feminine fashion statements that are often lost on those around him. NGO staff gossiped about how Mavuto was a trans woman, but didn't know it yet, even though he identified as a gay man or MSM. Speculations on the part of NGO staff about the identities of clients were common, as in a masculine-looking lesbian didn't yet know she was butch or a trans man. The idea that LGBT Malawians held misconceptions about their own identities was one way in which the NGO continued to justify proliferating workshops, almost all of which began with exercises that comprehensively defined the individual letters that constitute LGBTQI. Such speculations conjure an essential self oriented toward categories or vocabularies that need be demystified in order for that self to become real. Real here implies not only recognition and legibility in NGO spaces, but potential access to material or social support through the ability to be counted and to count. It is through mastering vocabularies and pedagogical exercises that fake gays are made into real gays, and here I'm indebted to Graham Reed's work. Much of Mavuto's small monthly cash flow comes from HRN. For each of the workshops he attends, he takes home between $15 and $25. This was in 2014. And enjoys lunch, snacks, and sodas. He also volunteers as a peer educator, which carried an incentive of 5,000 kwacha, or $14 per month, in 2014. Even as Malawian newspapers decry the influx of gay rights and a gay agenda by accusing people of being gay for pay, Mavuto lives that logic. He is paid because he is gay, and sometimes he even explicitly joked about this. In August 2014, I spent 10 minutes in a dusty car park trying to capture the perfect photograph of Mavuto. The series of photos feature him with his back to my camera, spotting a Maasai blanket, or a shuka, that I gifted to him. As I gave it to him, a project officer nearby suggested we stage a photo of Mavuto that could be included in a human rights violations book HRN was preparing. Ultimately, the photo was deemed too boring to merit inclusion. His turned back and body cloaked in the shuka make him into a symbol for the difficulties faced by gay men living in the shadows or behind masks across much of Africa. The photo shoot prompted him to retell a story he had previously shared to be included in what became a rainbow-colored booklet, HRN's report on LGBT human rights violations that year. As he spoke, a colleague asked me to take notes, interrupting Mavuto to suggest that he had told the story differently a few months back. In April 2013, Mavuto and his friend Chifuniro were invited to be speakers on a panel on human rights, hosted by a popular Christian radio station. Although the boys were promised that their voices would be altered so listeners would not be able to identify them, Mavuto's very feminine voice was left unaltered at one point. Soon after, they were beaten by the public, faced threats that their salon would be burnt down, and disowned from their church. The photo I took was meant to complement this story, to package and frame something of Mavuto's precarity amid homophobia for faraway patrons, and of course to meet indicators imposed by the organization funding the book. Whereas Mavuto might gain access to global publics through his representation as a victim, however, the nuanced everyday text he produces, which often contest the static and homogeneous imaginings of LGBT Africans, often remain invisible. At the close of the first day of the workshops mentioned above, we printed out copies of a manual I had co-authored with NGO colleagues and asked participants to read it over before the next day. The manual will be used by MSM, who would train future peer educators, the training of trainers model. Mavuto expressed his interest in commenting on the chapter titled Coming Out. The next day, he returned and gave a campy performance in which he summarized and critiqued the chapter he read. I noticed he was referring closely to handwritten notes transcribed onto the pages of a memo book, a standard workshop gift. I asked whether he might share the notes with me so we could incorporate them into the manual. As I leafed through them, I was impressed with his meticulous work, but soon realized that Mavuto had largely copied the notes from the Wikipedia entry for Coming Out. Mavuto's performance was a hit with his audience of peers, HRN staff members, and myself, all of whom were unaware of his script. Indeed, his mimetic ventriloquism of Wikipedia's wisdom, carefully collated the night before from his secondhand smartphone's cracked screen, might be read as a metaphor for the tensions anthropologists and others have identified between the global gaze, with a Y, and local social identity and practice. Mavuto's Wikipedia script worked as a kind of tactical camouflage. He conceals himself so as to become legible in this workshop space. So here I see resonance with Sasha Newell's analysis of how bluffing operates, not unlike masking rituals, among Ivorian youth who engage in conspicuous consumption of American brands amid a market flooded with counterfeits. Similar to how they cobble together real fake performances of wealth and style, Mavuto's really real self, the existence of which I and queer theory would of course dispute, but which donors seek to coax out of queer African subjects, is simultaneously signified and obscured by deceptive surfaces. Mavuto becomes legible in photos and monitoring and evaluation reports sent back to donors to capture the essence of workshops or justify how money was spent, but what is visible in such reports is a simulacrum. Mavuto's bluffing parallels masking logics as they play out in Ivorian rituals discussed by Newell, where deceptive visual masking performances reference the invisible and authentic that lie beneath for those in the know. Building on Newell's analysis, however, I would suggest that Mavuto's queer masking undoes the illusion of the authentic or real altogether and queries whether anyone is really in the know: donors, NGO staff, the anthropologist, Mavuto. Mavuto's queer subjectivity emerges at the intersections of his self-definitions, others' readings and classifications of him, his masking and unmasking, in workshops and on mundane life, and encounters and transactions with potential to enhance his survival. It is less interesting that Mavuto passes, that his performances go unnoticed as performances, or that he seems to be engaged in the kind of becoming gay that donors envision. But it's more important that he pieces together or creatively concocts his body self to asymptotically approach, but never fully attain, metrics of the really real imposed by audit culture and dominant NGO narratives of transformation. Much like the photo of Mavuto shrouded in a cloak, his performance in the workshop space conceals as much as it reveals. Mavuto mimetically and competently plays with the very precarity he is pigeonholed into symbolizing by NGO staff and donors. Mavuto, whose daily travels through Malawian social worlds are impeded by beatings and verbal attacks, adeptly garners resources, money, and status, of course at a small scale, from multi-scalar actors by engineering his performances to match his perceptions of audience interest. In his imaginative identification with MSM, or key population, that interests those above him, he builds a theory of survival where his performances are ever mindful of the multiple interpretive communities and economies that intersect around him. He pins his hopes for a better life precariously on precarity itself, that is, by brokering his vulnerability. The workshop form, an artifact of the circuits of resource distribution that characterize LGBT rights networks in the Global South, is a space where the boundaries of real and fake, or sincere and cunning, become blurred. For example, depending on a specific donor's interest, a workshop or training held one day might call for 10 WSW, women who have sex with women, and 10 MSM. The next might require 5 WSW, 5 MSM, and 10 trans persons. Between these two workshops, the same individual might undergo a temporary transformation from WSW into trans, or MSM into trans, so as to ensure quotas for attendance, as parsed by sexual orientation or gender identity, might be met. Yet this faking for the purposes of attaining metrics hinged to monetary or other gain has the potential to become real, as in the numerous cases of young lesbian-identified women who came back from trainings on LGBT rights in South Africa and suddenly, according to NGO staff, began identifying as trans. Quote, "They learned that language there in SA," the program officer informed me. Yet, while NGO staff found this transformation surprising, becoming queer anywhere is a process of employing semiotic, social, and material resources developed in social relations and transactions. So the NGO space, I suggest, is merely a convenient window through which we can observe intimate pedagogies in action and chart the ways in which selves gain coherence or unravel in real time, in close and very obvious proximity to explicit categories, MSM, WSW, LGBT, ETC. ETC is not a category. Maybe it's the next one. MSM peer educators, too, toe the line between real and fake, and here this is resonating, I think, with Matt's paper, in going about their work in the field. In June 2017, I co-led a training for new peer educators, PEs henceforth, in northern Malawi. At this meeting, the 9 new PEs signed a detailed memorandum of understanding, MOU, to formalize their position as volunteers with HRN. They received backpacks for carrying materials like lubricants, condoms, and info sheets. They learned how to document effectively every encounter they had with an MSM client and how to use the referral forms that would send MSM in need of healthcare to district hospitals. Most of the meeting was spent reading the MOU aloud as a group. Much emphasis was put on the fact that the monetary incentive that PEs would receive at the end of the month was not a salary, but a gesture of thanks. Nonetheless, throughout the session, the PEs referred to their volunteering as kuguiranchito, or work, labor, working. The HRN staff member explained they would only receive their monthly incentive via Airtel Money if they successfully submitted documentation of all the encounters they had with MSM in the field, and if it was clear they were finding enough MSM each month. One PE asked, "But what if we can't find enough MSM in a month? How many is enough?" She suggested the PEs just focus on helping others rather than worrying about numbers. If they did a good job, she said, it would be obvious. Yet the lack of clarity around expectations worried them. They all said, sometimes we can't find enough, or we already know them all. I share this anecdote not to throw into question whether the peer educators subsequently engaged in forms of cooking data, like recruiting fake gays or fabricating the data altogether. Instead, I aim to illustrate the absurdity of audit culture, rooted as it is in metrics that claim to but cannot accurately measure what is really going on. This absurdity intersects in complex ways with the economies of harm that peer educators navigate. So they're willing to put themselves at risk through being associated with a gay project, carrying gay paraphernalia in their bags, or in order to earn what they see as a salary, around $13 a month this year, for labor whose value is obscured by reframing small payments as gifts for sincere and passionate volunteering. The creative tactics that might emerge from this economy of harms are helpfully refracted through the figure of the fake gay. Peer educators are pressured to recruit a monthly quota of gays quantified in boxes on a page as clients, that is MSM, reached, even as they fit being gay for pay awkwardly into the larger social topography of their lives. It is the categories invented by global health and human rights regimes that fetishize indicators and quantification, I suggest, that counterfeit or fraudulently imitate the persons they seek to know. I'm almost done, sorry. Amid such magical conjurings that quantify success stories, LGBT persons become good at faking, a genre of social aesthetics through which gayness is signaled but never confirmed. Indeed, faking discursively permeates NGO spaces. At HRN's office, widespread jokes about fake gays, real gays, recruiting gays, being gay for pay circulated on a daily basis. One morning in August 2017, a group of us sat down to brainstorm ideas for a grant opportunity that had come into the executive director's inbox. When I looked more closely at the eligibility criteria, however, I noticed that only organizations led by, quote, lesbian women could apply for the grant. As the ED is a cis man, we dispersed. The rest of the day, however, was peppered with jokes in the halls. So, has he become a lesbian yet? Is the money ours? And let's just bewitch the ED and make him into a lesbian. The fake gay is a figure that relishes his ambiguity as liminal, as a malleable subject who makes life more livable by transgressing categorical, moral, neoliberal, and even queer logics that seek to fix him in place. Differentiated categories, the component parts of LGBTQ, MSM, WSW, create and clarify the conditions of existence of real gays and produce the desire to discern the real from the fake, as much as donor categories and discourses that counterfeit the realities they claim to improve produce value through the figure of the African victim of homophobia or HIV, so too do LGBT Malawians find ways to turn categories into queer sites of play and production in the spirit of being gay for pay. Thanks.
Great. Well, I had the opportunity to read the papers in addition to the PowerPoint, so I'm going to speak to both of those things. Let me reflect on a few of the points that came out of each of the papers. First, with Matthew on Côte d'Ivoire, very compelling story of the impact of structural adjustment and neoliberal reforms on the Ivorian health system that more or less continued with the coming of PEPFAR and the new donor AIDS money, and how that introduced a whole big new power dynamic and its very narrowly defined goals that we've been hearing about, the data goals. Find the positives, find the MSM, find the FSW, and if we can't find them, where are they? Do we know them all, and have we found them, or where do you get them? And doing what is often called results-driven performance measurements. So the data point is what it's about. It's not the people. And then he talks about how the key populations, another wonderful term that's been coined in this new era, navigate the system, and they work in and around the various systems of the NGOs, adopting and bending NGO agendas to achieve their own locally relevant goals. Speaking to the creative ways that people really do try to attempt to make meaning out of the multiple forces that are impacting on their lives, and take advantage of the opportunities that come their way, and why not? And then Paul, very interesting paper as well, considering the global flow of the term sexuality and the naming and designation of sexual subjectivity and practices, and revealing how the term queer didn't quite feel useful and helpful while doing your research, and it didn't speak to the multiplicities of the sexualities that you were seeing. But again, acknowledging that the terminology is important, and if we are going to have some kind of an intelligible cross-cultural way of talking about categories of people, then we do need a common language. For better or for worse, we're stuck with these words that we produce. An important point in reference to his applied work that he's been doing in HIV and how sexuality is often framed through these institutionalizing categories in ways that are often very insensitive to the realities of people's lives. And again, speaking to that audit culture that has been coming up, and acknowledging the compromises, some could call it intellectual torture, that one makes when doing policy or donor-related research, as opposed to the more self-determining world of anthropological research. And that, again, feels intellectually uncomfortable. And Paul also discusses how his long ethnographic experience, how it relates to the HIV and AIDS terrain, and raises the issue of the post-AIDS, and how that is sort of reviving and giving a new vigor to these categories of high-risk populations. And when we control the epidemic amongst these high-risk populations, such as amongst the MSM, then that will be a great big hallmark of the epidemiological control of AIDS. And the new identities, I am MSM, that have arisen in Calcutta and other places as well is very interesting, and in the context of other modernizing forces. And it points to our need to really pay attention to these terms and the designations and the meanings as we head towards this post-AIDS era of ours, and how some of these might change, and what becomes of the stigmas that continue to be attached to these. And finally, Cal's paper on the fake gays. Last night I told my daughter I was going to be discussing at a session where we're talking about fake gays, and she said, "What's that?" I said, "Well, think about it a bit, and you might arrive at an answer." Traces the queer becomings, and as they play out in the Malawian NGO, and poses the question, is anyone really in the know, including the subject themselves, given the masking performances and the cobbling together of the different body self queerness, and that aligns with this audit culture that currently dominates public health, and it dominates the donor NGO narratives. The pressure to find the MSMs and to get the numbers. And this wonderful quote that is just so perfect, I think. Categories within global health that fetishize indicators and quantification tends to counterfeit the persons they seek to know. Thought that sort of captures it all. So let me draw together 4 common threads that I see in the papers. One, the issue of precarity, ongoing precarity, the everyday verbal and physical attacks and stigmatization that gender and sexual minorities do experience in Africa and elsewhere. Second, how this audit culture that we have and current global health parlance has really fostered categories and labels that fit uncomfortably, and they're problematic in themselves. And the structural realities that cause people to adopt these new labels and to use them to their advantage to navigate identities in creative ways. Thirdly, how the AIDS epidemic has opened up spaces for us, and how these new donor monies, for better or for worse, has allowed for a lot of ethnographic research into issues around sexuality that may not have been possible before. But at the same time, they've truncated our engagement with these categories while opening up the space. And fourthly, how creative people really are in bending and adopting agendas of organizations, but also in bending and adopting their own identities and their own ways of categorizing their sexual orientations for different purposes. So finally, I think the papers all do a very good job in reinforcing the arguments that we really need to keep the public within public health as we go forward, as we move towards this end of AIDS, post-AIDS period, and the realities of people's lives and their actual experiences with all of this around them, and how they really understand their orientations, their identities, to keep that at the center of our work, whether it's applied-oriented work or whether it's just research for the sake of research, and whether or not there is a boundary between those two. Thank you. I enjoyed those.
I'm actually going to sit. Yeah. This has been a really exciting panel. Thank you to everyone for agreeing to participate on behalf of the organizers. So unfortunately, as I mentioned, Richard will not be able to attend, and we do have his words, so I'm going to read his text. The camera guy's making a motion there. And Richard's remarks are actually quite short. The good thing is that gives us lots of opportunity to discuss these really rich papers. Thanks to the organizers of the session for the invitation to participate. And apologies to all for being unable to present due to some health issues that fortunately are not terribly serious, but that have made it impossible to travel. I have nonetheless had the chance to read 3 of the papers being presented today, and I understand the session as, at least in part, an opportunity to present work in process with the goal of getting feedback and input that may be helpful as authors continue to work on their analyses. And I believe all 3 of the panelists and Elsa as well are working on toward book-length manuscripts, which is exciting. All 3 papers make important contributions to the overarching theme of the panel, Making Up MSM. They address key questions articulated by the organizers of the session. For example, in what ways does a new classifying category such as MSM acquire social and political meaning in global health? How has this category, originally developed in community-based HIV prevention efforts in countries such as the UK and the USA, been appropriated by epidemiology and employed by public health researchers and policymakers to imagine groups of quote-unquote hidden men who were thought to have escaped the purview of HIV programs targeting gay men? And how is it extended to all men who have sex with men, including gay identified, as part of the contemporary architecture of HIV program design and implementation? How is it transformed existing in emerging communities into populations? And how has it traveled outside of Euro-American and Anglo-American context, taking on new meanings, being employed in public health projects that aim to mobilize, measure, and manage such key populations, but also being employed in complex and diverse ways by many of those that it has categorized in order to construct their own life worlds in ways that positivist science largely fails to apprehend, but that anthropological analysis has been uniquely well positioned to investigate and analyze. All 3 of the papers that I was pleased to be able to read, by Cal Baruch, Matt Toman, and Paul Boyce, are still very much in progress, at different stages of completion, but all of them already make important contributions to answering these questions, and all of them, when published in their final form, will surely make important contributions to early 21st century anthropological research on HIV and AIDS, gender and sexuality, and global health. Yet while the 3 papers share many of the same theoretical frameworks and methodological approaches, they also offer very diverse analyses of these issues and situate their analyses in very different ways. Baruch's paper, Fake Gays, Tactical Camouflage and Queer Becomings in Malawian NGO Worlds, for example, focuses on the ways in which categories such as MSM, gay, and gay for pay are articulated and manipulated at different levels of the peculiar food chain that has been produced as part of the global AIDS industry in the early 21st century. It makes an especially important contribution by illuminating the ways in which these categories are used on the ground by social actors, both queer and not queer, to construct their lives, build their sexual subject positions, and make their way in the world. In doing this, it provides insights that probably no other non-ethnographic approach could hope to offer. It also documents the processes of masking and unmasking that are central to AIDS organizing as well as LGBT activism. In MSM Orientations, Paul Boyce addresses a range of related issues to explore the lives and life worlds of same-sex desiring people, predominantly male-bodied and transgender experiencing subjects in West Bengal. Building on a tradition of work focusing on sexual subjectivity and non-normative desire, and he's referring to the longer paper here. His paper challenges the very notion that what might be called sexuality can be captured by the need to labels that have been designed in an attempt to manipulate this reality. He shows us how various types of intervention on the part of community-based organizations, as well as the AIDS bureaucracies in which they are so often positioned, are involved in producing sexual subjects. He also calls attention to the ways in which PrEP has been linked to the elaboration of an end of AIDS narrative, perhaps signaling a new moment in which the AIDS industry will give way to the increasingly runaway train of global LGBT organizing, in which the exportation of sexual identity encounters the existing terrain of sexual subjectivities. In Matt Toman's Making MSM Count in the Shadow of the Shadow State, HIV Interventions in NGO Governance in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, we see the ways in which the fight against HIV epidemics among key populations, such as men who have sex with men, is waged on the part of large non-governmental organizations that act as intermediaries between donors and community-based organizations, and the ways in which CBOs, who serve as subcontractors in the system, are charged with doing the on-the-ground work of reaching these men, while staff at US-based NGOs engage in monitoring and program evaluation. While these grassroots organizations are incorporated into the non-profit system, laboring in the shadow state of large nonprofits, they also create new ways of working in and around these systems, adopting and bending agendas in order to achieve locally relevant goals and picking up circulating ideas about sexuality, personhood, and health. What is perhaps most striking in these rich analyses is the tension found in all three papers between ideas and practices related to sexuality, gender, health, and human rights that travel with lightning speed under conditions of high 21st century globalization, and the nuanced making and unmaking, masking and unmasking that happens at the grassroots as subjects make their way in the world, pursuing their own life projects and working within the systems they encounter in order to construct their own experiences, very similar to what Suzanne is saying. It is this tension, at least for me as a reader, for Richard as a reader, that most clearly situates these papers as part of a new wave of 21st century anthropology and sexuality and gender, HIV and AIDS, and global health. By critically analyzing the effects of global HIV and AIDS programs and policies that are built on the assumption of what are understood as fixed and universal categories, all three papers offer key insights into the ways in which knowledge and power can travel through global health interventions, as well as through social movements and civil society organizing, and on how it becomes meaningful both in the lives of individuals and of local communities. And those are his words. So we have time for questions, and we were instructed to pass around the microphone, so I'm going to take this off its stand and bring it down to anyone who has questions. Oh, they're going to? Okay, I didn't see that one there, okay. Yeah, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks for all these really wonderful papers. My name is Stephen Muldrum. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. I'm going to come up and give you guys my contact info after, because I gave a paper on MSM here yesterday, and I actually work in the domestic context in Atlanta. And a lot of what y'all are saying resonates with my experience in Atlanta, particularly in an environment where you're having a really under-resourced LGBTQ health infrastructure. A lot of MSM dollars are actually being used to support LGBTQ programming, kind of both under the political radar and just because the money isn't there otherwise. And so that's happening here too, as are the emergence of MSM identities in Atlanta. However, what the subject of my paper was, and this is the dissertation chapter I'm writing now, so I'd like to be in conversation with you all like now if we could, is this use of the phrase identify as MSM, or self-identified MSM, or out MSM and closeted MSM. So in Belstorf's 2011 article, which is great, he actually very clearly misreads his primary sources. His primary sources are actually not referring to self-identified MSM. When the examples that he points to in the report from Vietnam they're actually referring to people who identify as Bong Lo, Bong Kin, or straight men. They're grouped behaviorally under the category MSM, and he uses the phrase consensual male partners of MSM to say that consensual male partners of MSM are not called MSM because they don't identify as MSM. However, actually, those are not men who are included in the sample, and consensual male partners are used to differentiate men who engage in consensual sex versus commercial sex in the paper. So this, and then he does so in the other source that he cites as well. And I've noticed this in Atlanta, thinking about Belstorf's article, which I love all the time, because obviously the phenomenon that he's documenting is real, the emergence of MSM identities. However, I've noticed that practitioners use the phrase identify as MSM when they're talking about their clients or people who do testing, or people they're doing tests with, or the people who are coming in for care. And what they actually mean is that during the course of the medical encounter, men will identify as having sex with men. And that is what they mean by identify as MSM, that they will identify as men who have sex with men, or that they have sex with men during the course of the medical encounter, but that has nothing to do with their identity outside of the medical encounter, where they are not identifying as MSM at all. And that's a huge phenomenon. And I'm wondering, yet the vocabulary and the grammar of identity and identification in MSM, alongside MSM, is used all the time. but more often than not, it is not actually referring to people who have that identity in other contexts. And I was wondering if you all could maybe comment on that a little bit. I also just want to say I have a colleague who recently died of, Kaposi sarcoma that metastasized, and I don't think we're anywhere near or even approaching or on a trajectory toward the end of AIDS.
I think one of the things that you're, sorry. I think one of the things that you're alluding to is about the traveling of knowledge and what happens when knowledge travels in different directions and resides in different places. So you might have within a kind of clinical encounter the marking of somebody or identifying somebody as an MSM is somewhat different to the person being self-identifying as MSM. But you can imagine these kind of discursive conflations happening quite easily. Within a certain kind of epidemiological, perhaps, knowledge paradigm, that difference is perhaps not necessarily very marked or important because you're trying to record a person who embodies or practices a certain kind of behavior, and you could conflate self-identity into that for that purpose. In other registers of knowledge making, that's deeply problematic, or it becomes very interesting for us in terms of thinking about the relationship between discourse, life world, practice, and so on and so forth. So I think for us these are very rich seams of ethnographic potentiality. I think there was a tendency sometimes to position the ethnography as uncovering a kind of grounded life world experience versus the kind of epidemiological or public health categorizing, and to see these as different systems of knowledge making and there's a problematic divide between them, which I think is also true. But I think what we can also do as ethnographers is actually look at how that knowledge is encompassed, as everyone does, into people's life experience. So knowledge practices become social practices in complicated ways which are sort of countervailing. Yeah. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That was really helpful. I guess, hearing your comments and your question just made me think about ethnography and what it can bring to all of these discussions. In some ways, I think your point about people actually taking up the category in the clinic, sequestered in the clinical setting, is almost an instance where the category succeeds or it doesn't fail in the way that, anthropologists are typically invested in showing.
But what's interesting is sometimes it's not even the category. Sometimes it is acknowledging that they've had sex with men in the last 12
it's
months,
like a
right?
phrase, yeah. And so, and I think part of what that raises for me as well is or making strange or defamiliarizing the clinical setting, because for all of us, I recently went to the doctor, like most of us at some point, and thinking about the forms you fill out, and it was actually an LGBT-friendly clinic, and thinking about how that scripts the encounter always already, and kind of making strange what is familiar is just going to this particular space and needing to articulate in certain registers and answer certain questions, and so I think for me what ethnography brings to all of this, and what your work demonstrates in complicating that narrative is of, does something succeed or fail? I think that I'm just not that interested in that question myself, and it sounds like, you're not either. And, I think what we as anthropologists bring isn't, the idea that, oh, it's not working like it should, because I think, anthropologists have been saying that forever. And, simultaneously, like all of our informants who do the interpretive labor that's often completely not recognized in all these conversations, like they also see that none of this is so-called working. But I think, we can bring to the table, my interest, I think, for example, in conversations with donors and things like that is not like, this isn't working. I mean, it's more so, you should be paying these volunteers more or something like that, I think. So, we are in this house of mirrors of categories, and I don't know, I don't think we're ever going to escape it.
Just really briefly, I think you're touching on something that's really important. In the Ivoirian context, there is the phrase "je suis MSM," so using the English acronym in an otherwise French sentence. And so one of the things that I've been working through for a long time now, and to your point, with folks who do or do not identify in that way, is then what does the epidemiological construct of MSM even mean in this context, right? If there are people who are saying je suis MSM, are they the same who actually identify as MSM are not the same as people who are behaviorally having sex with, or who are having sex with men? And so, yeah, I mean, but at the same time, you know, I always kind of run up against this wall because, well, we can replace that category with another term, a local term, an emic term, I suppose, but people have different operational definitions of what those mean as well. So I left out a whole bunch of stuff on language and categories today that are outside of this sort of biomedical MSM or gay or LGBT kind of category. And I'm not, you know, I don't think that just calling it something else is going to make the metric better. And yes, please give me your card later. I'd like to stay in touch.
Can I just say something further?
Wait, we could probably just take that off.
Maybe, yeah, but that would be more useful. I just wanted to acknowledge what you also said about your friend, and yes, that I think the claims of a post-AIDS moment or era are hasty and belie the fact that many people are still acquiring HIV and dying of AIDS, and we need to remember that. It was World AIDS Day yesterday, and I just wanted to hold that thought, really.
Can I just say one more thing?
Should we take that out?
A shameless plug. With there, you know, I think in some ways, and I'm not sure, Suzanne, where you stand on this, but the term I read it as being used somewhat ironically, and there's a shameless plug here. Along with Richard Parker and Nora Kenworthy, we just came out with an open access piece on global public health called "From Global Crisis to the End of AIDS: New Epidemics of Signification." That looks at this discourse of the end of AIDS and resulting policy decisions. So you'd probably be interested in that.
Yeah, just to add on from that, it sounds like you might be in a good position to keep an eye on what is meant by control. How is control experienced in people's lives? Because we are heading towards a post-AIDS narrative, and it's a narrative of triumph. And we've got to know what that really looks like.
Hi, Doug Feldman, SUNY Brockport. Couple of points. The first one is I just want to, by the way, I want to speak in favor of the term MSM only as an epidemiological term. And that people, you know, I'm sort of surprised people are identifying, saying, you know, I am MSM. None of my friends would say that, you know. You're trying to convert an epidemiological category into a social category, and it doesn't really work. I think it's useful as an epidemiological category. By the way, one of the ways that it really caught on back, I think, in the early 90s, when it started proliferating as a medical term, is that the people who were writing research grants for NIH discovered that Jesse Helms, Senator Helms, was trying to defund all of the abstracts for grants that were being put in that had the word gay or bisexual in it. So what they did was they started using the term MSM instead, and he didn't catch on to that, or he didn't have his assistants catch on to that, so that they were able to have the term MSM in their meaning gay and bisexual, and still get, you know, and not worry about being defunded or an attempt to defund it. So I think that it was useful at that point. It's also a useful term, I think, in the sense that it also brings in the fact that there are many different kinds of gay communities. In my research in Rochester, we were looking at the bear community, at gamers, and so forth. And people have different. Of course, people don't necessarily identify with any of the groups and still can be gay or bisexual. But then there are also many people who are straight identified, as you know, who are engaging, you know, homosexual behavior, same-sex behavior. So that MSM from an epidemiological view is actually a very useful term. However, when you start getting into the point where people then say, well, I am MSM, it's sort of like, it creates this artificial construct. My other point is that PEPFAR should, by this point, I mean, they really got going in 2004, it's 2017, and the same applies to the Global Program on AIDS, where they're trying to get into, you talk about this audit culture, they're trying to show numbers. They're trying to show success of how many people they have served or enlisted into treatment programs and so on. While that is well-intentioned in a sense, the problem they're running into is that they don't have the anthropology. They don't have the ethnography. For instance, in Abidjan, they're saying, well, how many gay people are there, et cetera. Where's the answer to that? In other words, who is doing, you could do social network analysis, social network research to try to find out about this, look at the sexual networks of gay men or MSM if you prefer, in Abidjan to find out, what the size of the gay community, and perhaps project, although it's a little bit more difficult, what the size of the not straight identified MSM population is in Abidjan. And then you would know what you're dealing with. By the way, I would suspect that the reason why the numbers have come down in terms of MSM identified HIV positive people is simply because it's an epidemiologic reality that while the first sort of layer of, in a sense, in this case, gay people who are brought into the program may have higher, because they have strong sexual networks, or may be more likely to be HIV positive, and that the next layer would have lower, weaker sexual networks, and therefore be outside of that area and may be more likely to be HIV negative. So it doesn't surprise me that that was found, and it shouldn't surprise PEPFAR or Global Program either. So there's a real need for ethnographies throughout Africa, perhaps throughout the world, on gay communities as they exist. Find out what are the social dynamics of the gay communities, what is the culture of the gay communities, and then you would know where to go from there. So it's a complaint I have, not to the panel, but to PEPFAR and the Global Program to really use the resources and the strength of anthropological research to be able to enlist their desire to create a more successful program.
So one thing that I'm thinking of right now is, so the 18%, right, they had this major biobehavioral surveillance study back in, I think it ran in 2010 and 2011, that found that 18% of men who have sex with men are HIV positive. I got that data. They were nice enough to share it with me, looked at it. Well, they've been including all these people who self-identified as travesti, some of whom now self-identify or are trans women, right? And so as I and they sort of just categorized them as MSM sex workers. It became this conflation with MSM sex workers and travestis. So that 18% doesn't actually represent what they think it represents. And I will, just a little bit of hope here. I mean, I gave this webinar while I was at ICAP at Mailman School of Public Health through my postdoc, and sort of, said that as nicely as possible, that this metric is totally off, and did not know that one of the PIs from that study was on the webinar. But I did hear from her very quickly, and she said quite directly that she had simply never thought of that travestis were just, to her, that she thought more of them as drag queens, is how she put it. And not even recognize, but then said, but it makes sense. They have a whole different set of behavioral risks. They're more vulnerable to other social structural violence and these sorts of things. So I think people are and she doesn't work at PEPFAR, but people are aware of these shortcomings. Well, not necessarily aware, but open to critique and then fixing them, at least in word or in conversation. I don't know that. But that's what I think is particularly troubling, right? Again, not only who does MSM represent if there are people who are identifying as MSM, but also if you're going to use that as an epidemiological construct, you have to do it right? It has to actually represent who and what you think it does.
Just like to say, Doug, I wish you were head of PEPFAR. All problems would be solved. But I couldn't agree with you more. Unfortunately, they'd rather hire epidemiologists, people with medical backgrounds. And I do find people with anthropology backgrounds by accident in many cases. They'll say, I actually have a master's in anthropology. Right. It's sort of don't tell anyone, or at least a BA. And many of those people they're young, inexperienced. They just got out of grad school, and the weight of bureaucracy on them is really something. And they want to do the right thing and keep their jobs, so their anthropology gets suppressed, and they play the game.
I'd like to throw something into the mix, which is something that I don't think came up in any of the papers, nor have I thought to ask the question of my interlocutors, nor has it come up in the conversation, which is that are MSM identities, necessarily, let's say, theoretically, someone who would say je suis MSM or I identify as MSM outside of just a purely formal medical encounter kind of relationship. I mean, these certainly aren't mutually exclusive with other identities all the time, although sometimes they might be. And how is that playing out in your guys' research? I must say also, I only work with practitioners. I'm not out in the population like it seems like some of you are. I only work with people who actually do work in HIV. So.
Yeah, so as in resonance, a lot of people do say, I am MSM in the Malawian context. But yeah, as I was hearing our papers, I just think that, I think it's, for me, I just observe a complete slippage of categories. I mean, people which is the same. I teach at Oberlin College, so it's pretty much the same. Oh no, that's going to be on video. But I think that it's a real slippage of categories. I mean, people will use the Jewa term Matanyula, people will say MSM, people will say gay, and sometimes that's I don't, again, the basis of my paper, I don't want to make claims around intentionality or sincerity, but I think that it depends on the context. People use the terms ironically. They, just like you would observe anywhere.
I think one of the things that I sort of allude to in what I read, but in the longer version of the paper, I'm sort of also questioning, well, what are identities? Are we, we can assume that we are identities, that we have them, and that they are us. But I mean, that's just one way of imagining being in the world, right? And we could imagine being in the world outside of that kind of way of thinking and being and categorizing experience. And I think actually, oddly, once you start to go down that direction to a sort of maybe a more phenomenological or ontological way of thinking, if you push those thoughts further, what I encounter then, or my experience of the MSM, it's not the only experience of it, but I think embedded within that is in a way a sort of a counter-identity or a non-identity discourse, and that, in a way, that's part of its appeal, perhaps for some, not necessarily for all, but I think certainly for some of the people that I was working with, that it's kind of like, it doesn't acquire the same kind of ontological status of saying I am gay or I am male. And, it's a way of sort of saying, in a way, I am nothing. I am an acronym. I mean, what is, and I think there's something in that, So I think we should take care to think that these MSM identities are just extant things in the world. There are other things going on,
Oh, wait, Rob, I just want to speak to Doug's mic. I guess it makes more sense to grab the mic. And I'm going to I just wanted to speak to Douglas's point around the epidemiological significance, because it was something that I encountered in my own field work in India, where working with sex worker collectives on HIV projects, I think it also speaks back to your point, male sex workers took up the term MSM to refer to the community. So it was part of, created the boundaries of community, we are MSM, such that when Pontis, their clients, were coming to the hotspots to hook up for sex, they saw them as not being MSM. And so one of the questions I had working in some of these public health projects is like, well, why don't you sort of mobilize and get these guys connected to health services? And they said, well, they're not MSM, right? So these are what I call these zones of exclusion. Different types of groups were excluded on the basis of where they, so I think the issue of MSM is configured very differently, sort of temporally and geographically. Because I can think back to different moments. So I think that's probably quite different in the places now in West Bengal, how people, and I think that's what I got from your paper.
It's constantly shifting, and I think all of these things are shifting, they endure in complex ways all at the same time. I think it's, I certainly identify with what you're saying when, yes, the punty or the...
Because there was a kind of a genealogy for how that unfolded. At first it was a way people were resisting identity, and then later on it sort of became a kind of identity.
The MSM thing.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so too, but I think it might still be also a non-identity identity of something. So, you know what I mean? I think it's kind of like we need to be careful about... sorry.
Feedback, sorry. Okay, I'm going to put the mic back and you can continue.
I think we just need to be careful about just assuming that the world is full of identities, and these I think there's other things, there are other ways of being or other ways of us analysing as ethnographers what's going on in people's lives. So, I mean, yes, that's one of the things that's probably going on. And I don't necessarily mean to see that as a temporal thing, that it was partly a non-identity that's just transmogrified into an identity. It might have, but if that's happened, I'm also wondering, well, what has happened there? You know what I mean? What is that about? I don't know sure about that. Anyway. Yeah.
So I'm going to have to go up and take the mic from here to respond to that.
Okay, yeah, sure.
I mean, that was part of... See, you're in a different state. So I was in some of the states which were Avahan funded, part of the HIV initiative, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation project. So there was a sort of a lot more at stake in trying to kind of corral people into these sorts of different identity spaces. And so the way that did kind of shape people's sense of being, I think, was quite different. And how it also got taken up in local political commitments, such that people would say these are the boundaries of community, and those people outlying there are non-MSM, which included also drug-using sex workers, other kinds of groups that weren't seen as part of lying inside the boundaries of community.
But I won't monopolise, but I've worked in some of the Avahan states as well, and in other capacities. And so, for example, similarly, kind of where the idea of being the key when people introduce themselves to, I'm a KP, I'm a key population. It's a similar kind of thing of what is going on there. You know what I mean? I mean, you could say, oh, a KP has become another, or key population has become another identity. But if that's the case, you know, ontologically speaking, that's quite an odd thing. You know what I mean? And I think it behoves us to remember that no matter, even if we're saying that MSM has become an identity, that's still quite odd. You know what I mean? Or at least it's something that's worth thinking about rather than just saying that that's happened. Do you know what I mean? And I think we need to keep thinking about it. And it partly is contextual, I completely agree with you, but partly it's a provocation to us as an ethnographer to think, how do I think about what are social worlds and what are they comprised of? Are they comprised of these extant entities that people inhabit going about, or are those identities also something that we need to unpack ethnographically, constantly? They're constant sites of becoming and unbecoming, We could get quite Deleuzian about it, but, Anyway.
Yeah, just to add on to that too, I think it's important, most of us are talking about actual LGBT, in quotes, identified people in our papers, but hearing you speak, I thought a lot about the ways in which these categories work as well to create transactions and relations between people categorized as MSM and others in, for example, like the health infrastructure. So I attended this past summer, Malawi's winter, a lot of trainings for health service providers, HSPs, and that was a really interesting moment because the NGO I work with was rolling out referral systems, and as part of that had to train health providers to be sensitive to MSM issues. And so what was interesting about that is people were very hostile toward the idea, but then quickly realized that there were some resources that would be flowing to the district hospitals, which needed resources, if they agreed to participate in this referral system. And seeing the negotiations around that, and hearing some of the HSPs literally say, well, we treat thieves, we may as well treat MSM, and there's some things in it for us. And when are we going to receive our gifts of various supplies and so on. So that, I think that adds another element as well. Like the category does all this other work, and what was particularly fascinating was to see the HSPs act out MSM identities because they had to do like role playing. So you can see why I'm thinking about the fake and the real a lot. But that was a very interesting moment, and to see how they have affectively embodied and performed that identity as a truck driver going to Mozambique and having an encounter with a health service provider and stuff like that.
So I wanted to ask a question that's sort of following the thread of thought in the discussants. And listening to the papers, what seemed also sort of one of the interesting consequential transformations that you were all tracking in the ethnography are these sort of effects of the quantification and the sort of insurmountable technical objectives of how, where are these 3,000 new MSMs going to be? And so my question is, perhaps not necessarily ethnographic, but since you have all been in field sites for several years, I'm curious, what was it like before? And because there have presumably been programs with technical objectives using indicators, and so really what were these sort of, what new things have come about that have really made this such a sort of significant change in what you were thinking about? Thank you.
So you mean like technologies of monitoring and evaluation?
Sure.
We're a bit stumped because I think, I don't know, but I'm a bit stumped anyway, because I think perhaps I have an ambivalent relation towards thinking about those technologies. A bit like you were saying, actually, it's kind of like the absence of the ethnographic or the anthropological viewpoint in much of that public health work. So I suppose I partly relate to those transformations, which may indeed be significant improvements in kind of HIV morbidity and so on and so forth coming about through those methods, but I still relate to them as kind of like the enemy. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the enemy of a kind of ethnographic sensibility, or enemy is too strong a word, but a kind of a counter discourse that I'm still preoccupied with thinking with and against at the same time. But I think it's also it's a good question, because it's also good not to get caught up with constructing those things as the enemy, because there are positive effects through means of surveillance, I'm sure, and so on and so forth, right? We know more about epidemiological knowledge is useful. A category like MSM, in that strict epidemiological sense, is useful. It tells us lots of really useful stuff when you're trying to, do something about an epidemic. But I suppose it's not the only, knowledge exists in certain kind of hierarchies, so I think many of us are positioned within a different place within the hierarchy, and in a way trying to offer a different kind of viewpoint, which still doesn't get much purchase within the kind of the orthodox mechanisms of global health,
Yeah, and I think following on that, again, the role of ethnography, I think that my first project was on demographers, so I was like an anthropologist among the demographers, so I kind of learned to love numbers in a certain way, because if I didn't I wouldn't be able to follow along with what was going on. So yeah, I think ethnography and anthropology don't, I don't try to have a negative orientation to these tools and technologies, and I think, Jim Ferguson's book about how, being counted is really important and is is in fact becoming a dominant form of labor, informal labor, as we've seen in all of these papers. And yeah, I think in Malawi, it's a bit of a different history and case in the sense that the first LGBT rights discourse, the surfacing of discourse as something in the media, in political speech, wasn't really until 2006. So it's quite late as a public idiom or a way of speaking. And the NGO that I work with is the first one working in Malawi, and it was formed in 2006. So remembering back to when I first started. I wasn't even working on this project at that point, but it was 2008, and they had no money, no resources. The government was completely hostile, and now with the Global Fund, the government is relying completely on this NGO, so it's sort of in bed very much with, in this very paradoxical way. But the NGO is funded by at this point 12 different donors, and so I guess the one thing I would say about all these audit techniques and technologies is just the massive amount of paperwork as labor. And Rayma McCabe talks about this really brilliantly in her forthcoming book, Medicine in the Meantime. There's a whole chapter on documents as labor. And that's something I've definitely observed in the long time of working with this organization, just like that has increased, the documentary labor.
I think just for sake of time, I want to get to Eileen's question if we have the time. So just real briefly, I would say Vin Kim's book does some of that work for me. There was in fact, it was the travestis who were out there in a very sort of radical political way in the 90s before this MSM category and the global scale-up of HIV testing and services among men who have sex with men. So I would point you to that, and I can give you a little bit more info one-on-one if you want to talk. Eileen.
Sorry, just see if I can remember my question now. Eileen Moyer, University of Amsterdam. Thank you for a set of really great, interesting papers. I'm curious, I think Rob's comment about what gets excluded in the sort of invocation of these categories is something that interests me as well. And I'm wondering if in the other sites you're seeing the same sort of, we're talking about making up people and making up MSM. It's like, what is it, or who is it that gets to be MSM? And I think for me, what I'm seeing is that generally there's class at stake. There's often the first people, and maybe this relates to what Doug was referring to, the first people that are being listed as MSM or male sex workers because they're the easiest to find. They're not the hardest to find, which is the exact opposite of what the intention was of inventing the MSM category of epidemiologists, which is to find people who do not identify as gay to count and these are generally what's happening is they're the people who identify in some way or are identifiable because they fit in a particular cultural imaginary of what a gay man looks like or what a man who has sex with men looks like. So I'd like to hear about the different ethnographic sites and what's playing out there.
So in Cote d'Ivoire, you just hit on it exactly. It's, I agree MSM has this purpose, right? Epidemiologically it tells us something and it's useful. What can get problematic, obviously, is when you count travestis or trans women as MSM. But in Cote d'Ivoire, there's a whole sort of set of politics of belonging around ethnicity, around class, and ultimately, I would argue, around modernity. Who's a modern Ivoirian, who's a real Ivoirian. And there is this way in which the people that I work with, these peer educators and these organizations do exclude certain whole swaths of the city because they're marked as Muslim, they're marked as unmodern, they're marked as maybe not really Ivorian, possibly a regional migrant. So it actually reflects back on this concept, this political, it's a fallacy, but this idea of Ivoirité, who's a real Ivorian, which was just a political maneuver that came up in the 90s to get the current president to not be a candidate. And so although they would never talk about Ivoirité, they do talk about use words like backwards or certainly Muslim. Muslim becomes this marker for violent. Muslim becomes a marker for ethnicity, for political affiliation. And there seemed, which is, in my opinion, a real irony given the role of Christianity in homophobic movements all across the continent, that somehow Islam is this exceptionally, this sort of cesspool of homophobia in these Muslim neighborhoods. So yeah, I would say they're completely left out because they're not, I don't think it gets articulated as they're not MSM, but more as that they're, I hate to say it, but almost not others, and perhaps not amenable to being reached because they're so different.
Yeah, I think I would echo that. I mean, I think I think the term operates really capaciously in Malawi, but the one thing would be, yeah, it's not that people aren't, but I guess there's an element, an aura of authenticity and realness that I think figures like the Beach Boy, there are certain sites where this NGO works, and depending on the district, there are like different resonances with the term, and I think, in reference to, thinking about Doug's point about the cohorts, like the first cohort, in Malawi, it's a very tightly knit community, and the people who, were based in the capital and the second largest city, sort of are the ones that, all know each other and are being poached now by other organizations who are trying to get a piece of the KP pie, and so on. So, yeah, but I think the Beach Boy stands out as there's certain districts, but lakeside districts where, I've seen them having a bit of a less real aura about them. But who isn't MSM? I think it's important here to note like WSW, like lesbian women who, having helped the organization author grants at this point, many grants, they really struggle to get funding for WSW, and, fitting there into the paradigms of, having to talk about the risk of corrective rape, which is a narrative that's very prominent, but I don't want to say it doesn't happen in Malawi, but it's a very South African narrative, and in the absence of recorded cases, it's the way in which these organizations have to latch on to narratives that are visible and make sense. So WSW are definitely not MSM, and they're not being over-researched at all. They're very under-researched.
I don't know what you think, Rob, but I think that India is one of those countries where actually there was a lot of activism around the idea that MSM, conflating people in one way or another with transgendered experience into the category MSM, quite early on in activism became cited as a particular kind of problem. Transgender side was a kind of activist term that was used to sort of describe that. And I think that has affected, not only that, but other forms of activism, have affected much more kind of transgender visibility within Indian activism, and also kind of at the level of the state with various legislation which has been passed, which have allowed for greater visibility and recognition of transgender rights at the national level. But that opens up another whole kind of problematic can of worms, where those forms of recognition also then affect forms of regulation and surveillance which become biomedicalized or legalized, which then eradicate the recognition of transgender experience, which is not amenable to the kind of categorizations which biomedicine or law would seek to apply to people's experience. So it becomes a new form of exclusion or problematic kind of monitoring, which is in a way externalized from transgendered experience. So I see that in a way as a kind of more contemporary mirror of some of the things that happened within the kind of MSM narrative earlier on in the epidemic, where that was also problematized. I don't see that the term MSM is used as much in India as it used to be. I don't know what your experience is, but I think it's still there, and it might shift as I think HIV is coming back into fashion, as it were, in terms of like being part of a kind of a national policy discourse. Certainly there are sort of like within the next 5-year plan for the National AIDS Control Organisation in India, there are specific targets and discourses around MSM. And also my experiences of them is that they don't really shift much. I remember sort of like at one point in my working life doing much more kind of national level sort of research projects about male-to-male sexual experience, and trying within those reports and presentations at big meetings in Delhi and elsewhere to sort of slightly nuance the use of that discourse, not quite in the way that I've done today, but sort of like shifting or problematizing it a little bit. I don't think that really had any I don't think any of us who were doing that, I don't think that really had an effect in a certain kind of way, but these things are like a juggernaut, you know what I mean? They just persist, the categories ossify, it's very hard to shift the registers of analysis in global health work. And I think, but of course, luckily for us, we're ethnographers, and we can also find that very interesting, you know. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, just that there are certain moments when and you're right, the term has kind of fallen out of favor.
Yeah.
And I also watched people sort of play and display them and play with these categories. Like, today I'm a CSW, today I'm a, and change what their identity would be the next day. And I think, and this is sort of the conversation Elsa and I have been having about seeing them as, in some sense, as identifications, as things that allow people to do and enter different kinds of spaces and access different kinds of resources. So looking at the existential sort of, what is MSM, looking at what can it accomplish for social actors taking up these identifications. And I think that's where it sort of gets us around trying to, because those are really, really sort of difficult questions to, yeah. Are there any other questions? I think we're out of time. Okay. Well, we just want to thank everyone for coming, and for the panelists, for wonderful papers and wonderful discussion. Thank you. Okay. Good night.